exactly what it was made of, how it was constructed, and of course whether there may be any other explosive devices out there, whether there is a wider threat.
Mark White, thank you for that report there. It's a really concerning story, and no doubt we will be following it throughout the day and the weeks ahead here on GB News. One of the points of that story that very much interests me, in fact, is that we've seen reports this morning that the cabbie potentially noticed that something was up. He had a suspicious passenger, and it sounds like he may well have prevented much further damage. I'm sure we'll all be very, very interested to see this story as it develops. But a story closer to the heart of Westminster now, and what we've seen over the last 2 weeks have been some pretty dire front pages, some pretty dire news stories for the Conservative Party. Indeed, what the Conservative Party seems to have brought upon itself with its response to an investigation within Parliament. And what we've seen in the last week in particular is that the Tory popularity has dipped. Let's have a look at the most recent poll from Opinium. And we can see on our screens coming up very shortly the voting intention of the country. And there you can see for the first time in quite a little while, the Conservative Party has dipped beneath the Labour Party. Indeed, it's not just that, but Boris Johnson's own approval has also been sliding. You can see his approval going down there and disapproval tipping over above 50%. But it's not all bad news for the Tory party, because Keir Starmer's approval rating has also not been particularly fantastic. Here, the Labour leader, you can see his disapproval is pretty steady above his approval. And what does this all mean? Well, looking at who the country thinks would be the best Prime Minister, we can see that Boris Johnson, despite all the weeks of stories, is still slightly ahead of Keir Starmer, which is a pretty extraordinary result. Well, to make sense of all of this, I'm delighted to say that we can be joined by Adam Drummond, who's Associate Director at Opinium, has been doing some of the work behind those polls, and indeed, it's fair to say many other pollsters as well are finding a similar trend. Is this all to do with sleaze?
Morning, Tom. It certainly seems to be at the moment. I think the story really is that third chart or fourth chart that you showed there, where we had the best Prime Minister numbers. So we had really the winner is none of these, on about 34%. So yes, Boris Johnson is still ahead by 1 point. So what is it, 26, 25% for Keir Starmer. But we're, in terms of the PM numbers, we're sort of back in sort of Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn territory, where the public didn't really want either of the two as Prime Minister, and really was disheartened with the incumbent, but not necessarily convinced by the alternative.
Jeremy Corbyn territory is a pretty damning indictment of a Labour leader who has tried very, very hard to disassociate himself from Jeremy Corbyn's legacy. Is this to do with that legacy, or is this just a Labour leader who doesn't seem to be able to inspire?
So the Labour leader I normally compare Keir Starmer to is Ed Miliband, actually, in terms of putting him in the zone of, that sort of uncomfortable zone. So what we saw with Miliband and Cameron quite a lot was Cameron had worse net approval ratings, but better raw approval ratings. So Miliband was less unpopular, but that's because fewer people had an opinion of him. When we look at all the individual measures that we have for party leaders, so things like trustworthy and honest, or decisive, or says what they believe rather than what they want people to hear, what's happened with Boris Johnson in the last couple of weeks is all of those numbers have got worse, quite considerably worse. So typically the good side of whichever measure we have is on about sort of 20-25%, and the bad side of them tends to be on about sort of 40 to 50%. Starmer's figures are better, but not that much better. The ones where he really does have an advantage, though, is on things like trustworthiness and honesty. So just basically what are well known to be Boris Johnson's weak points are the ones where Starmer has an advantage. But as we've seen in the other numbers, it's not necessarily enough to put Labour decisively ahead. And it's kind of notable that after a really, as you said, a really dire couple of weeks of headlines for the Tories, Labour's managed to get ahead by 1 point for the first time since January.
Yes, it's interesting looking at some of the other parties in these polls as well. I've noticed that the Green Party seems to be a little bit higher than it usually is. In your poll, 7%, in some other pollsters, up to 10%. I wonder to what extent is that actually a benefit for the Labour Party? We seem to be, when we get close to elections, these smaller parties get squeezed. that would surely benefit the Labour Party.
You would assume, yeah, that's a reasonable thing to assume, in that when we look at how Green voters voted last time, or who they prefer for Prime Minister, etc., they are by and large a Labour-leaning group. What you would also expect, though, is that we've had COP26, and if you look at the question about what are the most important issues facing the country, different pollsters ask it in different ways, but some combination of environment and climate change has been climbing and climbing and climbing, especially after COP, as we've just had. It's, I think, third after health and the economy. So I don't know whether this is a high watermark for for concern about that. You would expect that to translate into the Greens doing well, in a similar way to the Greens' best ever electoral performance was in, like, I think it was the 1989 European elections, just after Chernobyl or something. So you'd expect the Greens to do well after environmental issues come to the forefront. But as you say, they are a Labour sympathetic group, and you'd expect them to be squeezed a bit more as we get closer to an election.
Greens doing so well in 1989 that even Nigel Farage voted for them then, as he never tires of telling people, although they were rather more Eurosceptic back in the day. I want to ask, because this isn't the only time that we've seen these sort of accusations of cash to mates, of sort of sleaze around the Conservative Party. We've seen those stories for the last year. Why is it only really hitting now? Why are all these stories about various pub landlords and PPE providers not really hitting home so much a year ago, whereas they are now? Is it because most people feel like we're sort of through the worst of the pandemic?
I think that's certainly possible. And I remember doing focus groups earlier on in the pandemic, before we were now, where some of those stories, there was an underlying level of sympathy in that things were crazy. They had to get PPE by whatever measure they had to. You grab whatever you can get. It's an emergency. And there's a lot of sympathy for the government and Boris Johnson being in that situation, and people struggling to think how they would have handled it if they were in that situation. But one of the things that I've noticed is that the thing that annoys the British public more than anything is the idea of people dipping their hands in the public purse for their own gain. And that's what a lot of these stories sort of sound like, and certainly have the ring of it, similar to the expenses scandal, however many years ago that was. And one of the other interesting questions that we asked was about this whole concept of second jobs, which seems like there's very much a sort of Westminster versus public divide on this, in that it's very much accepted among MPs that you can do outside work. But when we ask even more kind of sympathetic variations of the question, like, do you think that people who have jobs where they need to do some work to keep their professional qualifications should be allowed to do that while they're serving as an MP? You get a very negative response in polls. So it does seem like there's a bit of a sort of culture gap there between Westminster and the rest of the country.
Yeah, people just generally don't like the idea that MPs might be comfortable in any way. And I wonder to what extent Boris Johnson's personality and popularity came from this sense that he was sort of an anti-politician, that he was a bit of an outsider, that he was railing against the system. And now he seems to be almost protecting those within a system that many people in this country are deeply suspicious of. We don't like people in power, people making decisions over our lives, lining their pockets as well. Is Boris Johnson becoming an insider?
I think, well, I mean, there's an inevitable fact, I think, you get of the fact that he's been Prime Minister for a couple of years, so you become sort of the ultimate insider there. But I think one of the underreported parts of the Tories' slide in the polls has been that on measures of economic trust and economic competence, they're sliding a bit as well. So, yes, this has been a particularly bad week in terms of headlines for the Tories and the focus on that subject, which wasn't really sustained back when we had things like the John Lewis story and that sort of thing back in April. Since the budget, actually, which was initially sort of received quite well, the Tories have sort of slipped behind on a number of economy indicators. So things like, which party do you think would make you and your family better off? Which one do you think would be better at running public services, etc.? So Labour's normally ahead on running public services. The Tories are normally ahead on making you and your family better off. But actually, now the results we've started to see look a bit like that Best Prime Minister question, where, yes, the most popular answer tends to be neither or I don't know. But it's no longer a lead for the Tories, which is, I think, what's partly sort of driving their slide in the polls more generally.
Fascinatingly, I saw one poll that showed that the Labour Party is now more trusted on levels of tax than the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party being seen as just as likely as the Labour Party to raise tax. Although it doesn't seem to be that there are any parties on the right that are doing particularly well out of this. We've seen that, for example, Richard Tice's Reform Party is standing in a couple of by-elections coming up soon. It doesn't seem to be taking off in a way that you might expect. There doesn't seem to be pressure to the Conservatives' right here.
I think it's one of those truisms that the centre of gravity in the public was always more kind of economically left-wing and socially right-wing than Westminster, or traditional views of the centre ground were. So it doesn't surprise me that much that they're not getting much pressure to be more of a low-tax party. I mean, yes, there was lots of they were at pains to say they were still a low-tax party after the budget came out and after the social care levy. But actually, the social care levy at the time, when we polled it in the abstract, was quite popular. And the idea of people paying more tax to fund things like the NHS is not unpopular. There's been a general swing away from back in the sort of early 2010s when there really was a feeling of, we need to cut things back, we need to cut spending, we need to cut, kind of everything. That has now gone the other way, which is kind of natural. What happens when you have a Conservative government in power is that public opinion sort of moves the other direction. It does the opposite thing when Labour's in power. It moves towards saying, oh, we're spending a bit too much, we need to cut back. So it doesn't surprise me that much that they're not getting much pressure, but also there's the general fact of politics that the parties of the right are really one party and parties of the left are broadly split, which is a fact of British politics for the last couple of decades.
Well, it's certainly an interesting one, and although polls are these snapshots that we get in between elections, we might well be getting a really quite large number of by-elections coming up soon, and we'll be able to put all of these theories to the test. But for now, Adam Drummond of Opinion, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really interesting discussion there. Now, I want to close by giving some of my thoughts about COP26. Of course, I was there for 2 long weeks, and I noticed interest sort of ebb and flow. And it seemed to me that when the world leaders were there, people were rather interested. Then everyone lost interest. And by the final day, these extra times, these deadlines being missed, these last-minute changes being demanded, people pricked up an ear. And I wonder to what extent people will notice who the villains of the piece are. So many protesters seem to protest against this government, so many people gluing their faces to the roads and screaming at government ministers. But it wasn't the UK government that was holding up global negotiations. It wasn't the UK government that was weakening and watering down. If anyone is to be protested over what happened on Sunday, surely it should be India and China. The countries that watered down the commitment on coal, the countries that put in jeopardy the entire premise of an agreement. It's interesting to read this morning what the British delegation was thinking at that time. Alok Sharma reportedly wanted to push this on, to take it to a vote to stand up to China and India. Whereas when China and India met the US and the EU, they capitulated. I wonder at what point environmentalists will realise that this government, that the government of the United Kingdom, is really on their side. I mean, it seems extraordinary that environmental protesters seem to be shouting loudest at the people who agree with them. A pretty extraordinary state of affairs. But it's true that COP wasn't the blazing success it could have been. There wasn't this amazing moment where all the countries in the world came together in a moment of harmonious agreement. What they did was come together in a moment of begrudging agreement, an inch forward, keeping 1.5 degree warming on life support rather than that clear trajectory. And I think it's fair in moments like these to say that things don't have to be a blazing success or a dismal failure. Things can muddle along through, and really that's what COP26 was. It was a muddle. There were some successes, and as Boris Johnson said this weekend, he gave it a 6 out of 10. And potentially 6 out of 10 is just enough to hope that everything will be pretty much fine. Well, that's my thoughts on COP26. I hope you've enjoyed listening to all of the stories we've been discussing this morning on The Briefing. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 9 with the stories that you most need to hear about the news of the day, the political news of the day. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Maroki. But first, here's the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Do we know what happened with Hodgins?
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. You're watching To The Point on GB News with me, Patrick Christys, and Mercy Maroki. We're here all the way through until midday with an absolutely massive show to kick-start your week.
Yes, here's what's on the menu. We'll be talking about lots, but make sure you get in touch with your views, as usual, on gbviews@gbnews.uk, and we'll be reading those out throughout the show. But first, let's give you the latest headlines with Rosie.
Good morning, I'm Rosie Wright. Let's get you up to date.
MI5 are assisting police investigating an explosion of a taxi that killed one person and injured another outside Liverpool Women's Hospital on Sunday. 3 men have been arrested under the Terrorism Act in connection with the blast. The passenger of the car was declared dead at the scene. The driver is in hospital in a stable condition. Boris Johnson has hailed the COP26 agreement as game-changing, but has also expressed disappointment after last-minute changes were made to the deal. Leaders agreed to phase down, not phase out, unabated coal after requests by China and India. Alok Sharma, the president of the conference, has apologised to delegates after he was forced to rephrase the pledge. Austria is putting its unvaccinated people into lockdown in an aim to slow the spread of coronavirus in the country. Anyone over the age of 12 who hasn't had the jab is now banned from leaving their home, except for working, shopping, going for a walk, or going to get the vaccine. It's estimated to affect around 2 million people. Now, a warning, this report contains flashing images. A 9-year-old boy is the 10th person to die after a crowd surge at the Astroworld Music Festival in Houston. Ezra Blunt died yesterday at Texas Children's Hospital. The real living wage has been increased across the country. The new hourly rate will go up to £11.05 in London and £9.90 outside of the capital. This will have an impact on more than 300,000 workers. In sport, Lewis Hamilton produced one of his greatest Formula One victories in Brazil, coming from 10th place on the grid. The British 7-time champion took the lead with 12 laps to go in Sao Paulo, dramatically overtaking his rival Max Verstappen. You are up to date. I'll have more for you on all of those stories at 10 o'clock.
Good morning, everybody. You're watching To The Point right here on GB News with Patrick Christys and Mercy Maroki. We've got a massive show for you to drag you kicking and screaming into the week, whether you like it or not. So here's what's on the menu.
Yes, 3 individuals have been arrested under the Terrorism Act after a man was killed in a car explosion outside a hospital in Liverpool. We'll be bringing you the latest from Liverpool with our very own Mark White.
We will indeed. And now, according to a secret Whitehall plan, the government is set to execute its pandemic exit strategy in the new year. We'll be giving you all of the updates on what that might look like.
Yes, and later in the show, we'll be talking about the latest on the Polish-Belarusian border as Putin blames the United Kingdom for the crisis and as migrants have broken through the perimeter. We have all of that coming up and much more across the programme, and you can get in touch with your views. As usual, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But first, Patrick gives his views on the terror attack suspected in Liverpool.
We have a new national hero, ladies and gentlemen. David Perry, remember the name. He's a Liverpudlian taxi driver who, it appears, saved countless lives with his quick thinking. It looks as though a suspected terrorist wearing a suicide vest got into David's car and asked to be taken to the War Memorial Service. Fortunately, the traffic was bad and the roads were closed, so in a scene straight out of the film Four Lions, this monster then asked to be taken to the city centre. There was apparently bad traffic again, so he just asked to go to the Women's Hospital. Details of exactly what happened next are a little bit varied, but from what is being reported in various newspapers, this lunatic in the back of the cab started fiddling with something and then started vibrating all over. It was at this point, apparently, that hero David realised that he was wearing a suicide vest, jumped out of the taxi and locked the man inside before the bomb was detonated. Can you imagine if this guy had got out of the taxi and made it into the hospital foyer? It's Europe's largest maternity hospital, and the scene would have been absolutely horrific. There's a fundraising page for David Perry and his family to help them recover from this ordeal, but I don't think that goes far enough. We need to knight this guy. Get Perry knighted. It needs to be Sir David Perry. We've knighted Elton John for services to bang-average music. Mick Jagger was knighted for prancing about and pouting a bit. If reports are true and this taxi driver managed to lock a suspected terrorist in the back of his car before he could blow up a room full of women and newborn babies, then surely he should be invited to get down on bended knee in front of the Queen and receive a knighthood. When he woke up that morning and he had a shower, a shave, or did whatever his usual routine is, and he got in his car, probably just thought, oh, I'll have a normal day as a taxi driver. Never in a million years would he have thought that he'd be called upon to potentially save dozens of lives. David Perry is the very best of British, and on Remembrance Sunday as well. Whenever this plucky little nation has been called upon in times of trouble, we've always answered that call. And that's exactly what David did. He's like a human microcosm of what makes this country great. Quick thinking, ingenuity, epic bravery, self-sacrifice. Apparently he had to have part of his ear stitched back on and suffered cuts and bruises. Although I imagine in the grand scheme of things, he probably feels like he got off relatively lightly. Unfortunately, there is a very limited amount that I can say about this particular incident now, because 3 people are now in custody, held under the Terrorism Act, and one would imagine there'll be a court case at some point. But according to reports, one theory police are probing is that the detonators on a potential bomb exploded, but not the main charge. That would be a repeat, for example, of the failed 21/7 bombings 3 weeks after the 7/7 atrocity in 2005. As the police investigation developed, 3 men aged 21, 26 and 29 were arrested as armed officers stormed a home in the inner city Kensington area of Liverpool within 90 minutes of the blast. It is being treated as a terror investigation. Those are the facts as we know it. But if it does turn out that a man in the back of a taxi was actually a terrorist who intended to blow up people at a war memorial, random passers-by in Liverpool city centre and then a maternity hospital, I think it's fair to say that it's just a shame that we can't revive him so that he can face justice. Yeah, you never know what you're going to do in a time like that, do you? But I think it's fair to say that David did the right thing.
Yeah, and as we say, it's still very much a developing situation. We reported there 3 people arrested under the Terrorism Act. We don't know the full details of what happened so far, but as you say, if what's being reported this morning is what it was, I mean, then it's extraordinary that he managed to do that. And, you know, as Patrick just mentioned there, he is being treated in hospital for some injuries he suffered. So he was seconds away, really, from potentially dying himself. And, you know, thank God he got out of the situation when he did. And, yeah, immense bravery completely. Yeah, 100%. And look, the whole thing, obviously, again, we do have to be quite a bit careful now because there is presumably going to be a court case at some point. But, you know, there are certain allegations out there. Of course, there are right across the media. And the police, indeed, have released certain pieces of information as well, as they understand it at the moment. And clearly, I think it's just yet another wake-up call, isn't there? That apparently there are some of these people out there, aren't there? And actually, it is a fascinating one in the sense of the quick thinking of this guy, and to lock him in as well. I mean, you know, it really is heroism of the highest order. And I think, you know, fundamentally, if you can't get knighted for this, what do you get knighted for, you know? Yes, it would be very interesting to see what he has to say when he's all better, and we wish him all the best, of course. Keep all your views coming in. We've got lots for you on the show this morning. gbviews@gbnews.uk, the email there on the screen. But coming up, a leaked government document says Britain's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is set to be dramatically scaled back early next year as part of a pandemic exit strategy. We'll find out what this means with our London reporter Alice Porter after the break.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else, I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Good morning, everybody. Patrick just did his monologue, if you tuned in for that, about 10 minutes ago, on the bravery of David Perry, who's a Liverpudlian taxi driver who appears to have potentially thwarted a suspected terrorist attack in his taxi. We've just received some news that he is actually now out of hospital. He received some relatively minor injuries, but he is now out of hospital, which is great news.
Fantastic news, yes, indeed. Right, so we're going to go into my inbox now, gbviews@gbnews.uk. Julie's been in touch. David Perry, he's the taxi driver. He deserves a medal. He's a national hero. Hopefully he has a speedy recovery. My thoughts go out to him and his family. Such bravery. And I think, Julie, you're echoing the thoughts of a nation today, really. I'm calling on this guy to be knighted. There is a funding page, apparently, on Facebook, if you go and search a bit of that, to try and help him and his family as they overcome the shock, I would imagine, of course, and any medical issues that they have. What a real hero that taxi driver was. This is from D. I hope he makes a speedy recovery. Certainly should get an award. He's more deserving than a lot of the others to get one, indeed.
Yes, and keep your views coming in on our email there on the screen, gbviews@gbnews.uk. But now for our top story of the day. Britain's response to the COVID-19 pandemic is set to be dramatically scaled back early next year as part of a pandemic exit strategy. That's according to a secret Whitehall plan, which was leaked to the Mail on Sunday this weekend.
Well, our London reporter, Alice Porter, is outside the Royal Berkshire Hospital in Reading for us now. Alice, thank you very much. What more do you know about these leaks, then?
Hi there, good morning. Yes, these leaked documents show Operation Ramp Down, and they describe the government's plans to dismantle the £37 billion that the government put in the sort of emergency infrastructure to help the country through the pandemic. That was the sort of plan that was in place, and this is the plan to sort of dismantle it as we work towards living with the virus. That was quoted in the documents, and of course that's a phrase that we've heard from Professor Chris Whitty throughout the last year or so. So what are the details of this leaks? Well, they say that they're going to axe the legal requirement for people to have to isolate for 10 days after being diagnosed with COVID. There'd be an end of test and trace. With COVID on the death certificate. But of course now